My husband introduced me as the help at his own gala. His mistress stood beside him with the title of partner. What neither of them knew, I owned the entire building they were standing in. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. Before I take you into this story, tell me in the comments where in the world are you listening from today? My name is Eleanor Sterling. I'm 35 years old. And for 6 years, I moved furniture in rooms I owned. Smiled at board members whose salaries I signed, and came home every night to a man who called me a glorified furniture mover. While he was wiring $250,000 of my retirement fund into an account I didn't know existed. He forged my name. He billed his mistress's spa retreats through my insurance. When I found out, he sat across from me at our kitchen table and told me I was paranoid. Then he filed a legal petition claiming I was mentally incompetent and had every account I owned frozen. I had $247 left. In my own empire. That night at the Sterling Gala, I stood near the east wall in a stained work vest, holding a clipboard. While Julian took the stage under the lights, his arm around her, 400 people applauding. Then he walked over, reached into his jacket, pressed a $50 bill into my palm in front of all of them. Go clean up, he said quietly. You're ruining the look. I stared at that bill. And I thought he has no idea what he just started. But here's what I keep asking myself, even now when you've spent years hiding who you are just to be loved for yourself. Does taking your name back actually give you your life back? Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. The penthouse smelled like money and fresh paint, the kind of sharp, clean scent that clings to spaces no one has actually lived in yet. 17 floors above the Gold Coast, the floor-to-ceiling windows framed Lake Michigan like a painting someone had hung there deliberately, the pale winter light pressing flat and silver against the glass, the water below the color of old pewter. Eleanor Sterling stood in the center of the living room with a measuring tape clipped to her belt and a clipboard tucked under her arm, and she turned the velvet armchair 2 inches to the left. She stepped back, tilted her head, 2 more inches. There. Now the sightline from the kitchen island carried all the way through to the lake. Now a person standing at the cooktop with a glass of wine in the evening would feel, without knowing why, that the room was holding them. That was the trick of it. The best staging work was invisible. You didn't see the craft. You only felt the result, the way a room settled around you like a coat that fit perfectly, and you thought, I could live here. You thought, I already do. Nora had been doing this for 6 years. Before that, she'd studied architecture at Northwestern, spent a year in Florence, learning how light moved through stone rooms, and come home to Chicago with a quiet, particular understanding of how space shaped the people inside it. She had built a small, careful practice, corporate staging, high-end residential, the occasional museum installation, and she loved the work with the specific love a person feels for something they chose entirely on their own terms. No one had pointed her toward it. No family expectation had pushed her into it. It was entirely, simply hers. The penthouse was listed at $15 million. The sellers wanted it staged before the weekend open house, which gave Nora 4 days, a team of 2 assistants, and a storage unit in the building's basement full of furniture she'd selected herself. She'd been here since 6:30 in the morning. It was now past noon, and she'd eaten half a granola bar over the sink in the service kitchen. Her work boots had scuffed the new hardwood twice, which had required 2 careful passes with a touch-up pen. Her beige work vest, she had 4 of them, identical, because efficiency was its own kind of elegance, had a streak of chalk dust across the left pocket. She was happy. That was the honest truth of it. Standing in a room that wasn't finished yet, surrounded by the particular satisfaction of a problem being solved, she was genuinely, quietly happy. The elevator chimed. She heard him before she saw him. The particular sound of Julian Vance's dress shoes on hardwood, sharp, deliberate. A sound that had always reminded her of a gavel came around the corner ahead of him, and then he was there, one hand loosening his tie. His eyes already moving across the room with the expression she'd come to recognize as his default, the look of a man cataloging what he'd already decided was insufficient. He didn't say hello. He never said hello when he walked into a room she was working in. It was one of those small things that had accumulated over 4 years of marriage. The way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a river slowly, invisibly, until one day the water doesn't flow the way it used to. The armchair, he said, setting his briefcase down on the kitchen island without looking at her. It's crooked. It's 2 degrees off the grid line, Nora said. It's intentional. It softens the geometry. It looks crooked. He pulled his phone out and began scrolling through it. The Hendersons are coming through on Saturday. Marcus Henderson is bringing 2 of his board contacts. I need this place to look like a serious investment, not like someone was rearranging furniture and ran out of steam. That's exactly what I'm doing, Nora said evenly. Rearranging furniture. That's the job. Julian looked up from his phone then. He had a particular way of looking at her when she said something he found inconvenient, a brief narrowing of the eyes. A small recalibration, as though he were deciding whether to bother correcting her. You look exhausted, he said, and the observation was not kind. I've been here since 6:30. You need to manage your energy better. I have the Meridian Partners dinner tonight, and I need you to be, he waved a hand vaguely. Present. Functional. Present. Functional. The words sat in the air like furniture placed wrong. I'll be there, Nora said. Julian moved through the living room the way he moved through most spaces, as though he were already considering what might be changed to better suit him. He paused at the window, looked out at the lake for a moment with the expression of a man who has decided the view is adequate, but not exceptional, and then turned back to her. Honestly, Nora, this job, the staging, the hauling things around, I don't understand why you keep at it. My career is the thing that matters here. Sterling's merger is going to change everything for us. You don't need to be moving furniture. I like moving furniture, she said quietly. You're a glorified furniture mover, he said, and he said it without particular cruelty, which was somehow worse than if he'd meant it to sting. He picked up his briefcase. Just fix the chair, and don't be late tonight. He left the way he'd come in. The elevator chimed, and then the penthouse was quiet again. Nora stood for a long moment with her hand resting on the back of the velvet armchair. The chalk dust on her vest caught the flat winter light. Outside the windows, the lake moved the way it always moved in December. Heavy and gray and indifferent, the kind of weather Chicago wore like a permanent expression. She moved the chair back to where it had been. Not because he was right. Because she was tired. It was later that afternoon, in the small home office of the apartment they shared in Lincoln Park, that she found the notification. She'd been looking for the property tax documentation Julian had promised to scan and email 3 weeks ago. The kind of administrative task that had quietly migrated from his column to hers over the course of their marriage, by degrees. So gradual she hadn't noticed the accumulation until she was doing nearly all of it. His tablet was on the desk, screen still lit. She glanced at it without intending to read anything. The notification from the financial management app was bright and clear at the top of the screen. Withdrawal confirmed $250,000. Destination international transfer account ending 7741. She picked up the tablet. Her retirement fund. The private account she'd held since before the marriage, the one she contributed to herself, separately, because Arthur Henderson, her godfather, her father's oldest friend, the man who'd drawn up every significant financial document in her adult life, had quietly advised her, years ago, to keep certain things in her own name. She had never touched that money. She had never authorized a transfer from it. Her hands were very still as she set the tablet back down. The silk tie he'd worn yesterday was draped over the back of the desk chair. And the scent reached her before she consciously registered it, something floral and expensive and entirely foreign, the kind of perfume that didn't apologize for itself. Iris, maybe, and something warmer underneath. It wasn't her perfume. She didn't wear perfume to work. She stood in the small office with the December light going gray outside. And thought, very carefully, about what she knew and what she didn't know and what the difference between those two things was going to cost her. From the kitchen counter, a mortgage statement caught her eye. She crossed the room and picked it up. The interest rate had climbed. 3 missed payments, compounded. Julian had told her, 6 months ago, that he'd set up automatic payment. She had believed him the way she'd believed him about the tax scans and the property documentation and the 100 other small administrative promises because she was busy. And she trusted him, and because a marriage required a kind of faith that could not sustain constant verification. She had been wrong about the faith. She was beginning to understand how wrong. Her phone buzzed. A text, arriving on Julian's phone, which was still on the counter, the screen lighting up just long enough for her to read it before it locked. The name at the top of the message was simply B. Did you ditch the help yet? The Chicago wind hit the windows, then a real gust, the kind that made the whole building creak slightly, a deep structural sound like something old settling. The glass held. It always held, but you could feel, in the particular way the building moved, that it was being tested. Nora set down the mortgage statement. She pressed her fingertips against the edge of the marble kitchen island and held onto it, the cold stone, grounding her until her knuckles had gone white and her breathing had steadied. I'm not the help, Julian, she said, very quietly, to the empty room. Outside, the lake was the color of a bruise. The sun had dropped behind the skyline, and the city was doing what it always did in December, pulling its collar up, tilting its face against the wind, and moving forward anyway. Nora picked up her phone and called Arthur Henderson. The morning after she found the notification, Nora woke before dawn and lay still in the dark for a long time, listening to Julian breathe beside her. His sleep was easy. It had always been easy, the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who had never, as far as she could tell, spent a single night staring at the ceiling wondering if he'd made a catastrophic mistake. She had always found it reassuring before. The steadiness of him, the solidity. She got up quietly, made coffee in the kitchen, and sat at the table. With the mortgage statement and a legal pad, writing down everything she knew in the careful, methodical way her father had taught her. Robert Sterling had been a deliberate man. He built things slowly and well, and he'd raised his daughter to understand that. The difference between a problem and a disaster was almost always the distance between reaction and response. Write it down, he used to say. When you can see it on paper, you can see what it actually is. What it actually was, written out in her own handwriting on a yellow legal pad at 5:30 in the morning, was this $25,000 missing from her retirement account. 3 missed mortgage payments. A perfume she didn't recognize on a tie she hadn't touched. A text from someone named B. And a husband who had told her, just yesterday, that she was a glorified furniture mover. She stared at the list for a long time. Then she turned the page and started a second list. It was 2 days later, sorting through the paper recycling before the Wednesday pickup, that she found the insurance document. It had been folded in half and tucked beneath a takeout menu and a grocery circular, not quite thrown away, not quite kept. An explanation of benefits from Sterling's corporate health plan. A claim processed under her name. The Service Luxury Wellness Retreat and Spa Comprehensive Renewal Package. The dates: the 2nd and 3rd weekends of November. Nora sat very still on the kitchen floor with the document in her hands and thought about the 2nd weekend of November. She had spent it in a dusty warehouse in Bridgeport, overseeing the intake of a storage lot she'd purchased at auction: mid-century dining chairs, a set of library shelves, 2 credenzas in need of refinishing. She had come home both evenings smelling of dust and wood oil, and Julian had said he was working late and she hadn't thought to ask why. The name on the wellness retreat: Mrs. Julian Vance. Her married name, her insurance, her husband's mistress. She put the document in a manila folder. She labeled the folder with a date and nothing else. Because the handwriting had to be steady and the folder had to be labeled before she allowed herself to feel anything about what it meant. That evening, Julian came home from the office at 7 and found her at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the folder in front of her. She had rehearsed the conversation. She had decided to be calm and specific and to ask questions, rather than make accusations, because she understood, in some precise and functioning part of her mind, that what she needed right now was information, not confrontation. I found the insurance claim, she said. Julian set down his bag. He looked at the folder. He looked at her. And then, without missing a beat, without the slightest flicker of the guilt she had expected, he smiled. What insurance claim? The explanation of benefits. The wellness retreat. My name, my insurance, November. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down with the ease of a man who had never been caught at anything. Nora. His voice was patient and slightly weary, the tone he used when he was explaining something to someone who was making things unnecessarily complicated. You have been under enormous stress. The staging business, the long hours have been worried about you. Doctor. Kowalski actually mentioned to me that chronic exhaustion can affect Julian, memory, cognition, the ability to track. Julian. Her voice was flat and even. I was in Bridgeport both those weekends. I have the auction receipts. I have the intake logs with my signature on them. He leaned back. The patience in his expression shifted into something cooler. You're being paranoid, he said. It's concerning, honestly. I've noticed it for a while, the way you fixate on small things, the way you build these narratives out of nothing. Your little decorating hobby is stressful, I understand that, but don't. She said it quietly, but it landed with enough weight that he stopped. Don't do that. He stood up, picked up his bag, and headed toward the hallway. At the doorway he paused and turned back, and the look on his face was almost kind. I think you should talk to someone, sweetheart. Professionally. I'm saying that because I love you. He went upstairs. She heard the bedroom door close. She sat at the table with the folder in front of her and her water glass untouched, and the word paranoid hung in the kitchen air. Like cigarette smoke in a room with no windows. The next morning she called Arthur Henderson and asked if she could come see him. Arthur's office was on the 14th floor of a building on North Michigan Avenue. A corner suite with a view of the magnificent Mile and walls lined floor to ceiling with law books that had actually been read. He had been her father's lawyer for 30 years and her own lawyer since she was 23, and she had never, in all that time, seen anything rattle him. He was the kind of man who had seen enough of human behavior to have lost the capacity for surprise, which was precisely why she trusted him. She put the folder on his desk. Then she put the tablet printout of the withdrawal notification beside it. Then, from her bag, she pulled the retirement fund account documentation. The original statements, with her signature on the initial enrollment forms, and laid them next to the printout. Arthur put on his reading glasses. He looked at the withdrawal notification. He looked at the account documentation. He picked up the EOB and read it carefully. Then he took off his glasses and set them on the desk and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It wasn't surprise. It was something older than surprise. Something that looked like the specific, controlled stillness of a man preventing himself from saying the first thing that came to mind. Nora, he said, very carefully. Tell me everything. She told him. All of it, the tie, the text, the mortgage payments, the wellness retreat, the gaslighting over the kitchen table. Arthur listened without interrupting, which was his way, and took notes on a yellow legal pad in his small, precise handwriting. When she finished, the office was quiet for a moment. The signature on the 401k transfer authorization, he said. That's not your signature. No. He looked at the document again. It's close. Someone who knows your handwriting. Someone with access to your financial accounts. He set the paper down with the deliberate care of a man handling something that has become evidence. Nora, has Julian ever had access to your login credentials? For the retirement fund portal? She thought about the morning, 8 months ago, when she'd been in the shower and Julian had called through the door. Asking for the login to the household financial dashboard because he was setting up a recurring transfer. She had told him from behind the shower curtain, because they were married. And she trusted him, and because the hot water was running and she hadn't wanted to get out. Yes, she said. Arthur's face didn't change. He picked up his pen. I want an audit, he said. Full financial audit, your personal accounts, the retirement fund, the joint accounts, everything. I have a forensic accountant I use for exactly this kind of situation. And I want you to stop telling Julian anything you discover. Nothing. Not a word. She nodded. And Nora. He looked at her over the rim of his glasses with the expression of a man choosing his words with surgical precision. I want you to locate the prenuptial agreement. She drove home through the fog. The lake fog was coming in off the water, the way it did in late November. Rolling over the shoreline in thick gray walls and swallowing the lower floors of the buildings along the drive. She could barely see the skyline. The city was dissolving into itself, all its solid certainties going soft and imprecise at the edges. And she sat at a red light on Lake Shore Drive and watched the fog move and thought about the prenuptial agreement she'd signed 4 years ago and hadn't looked at since, and where, exactly, she'd put it. She had been methodical about it, she remembered. She had filed it somewhere she wouldn't accidentally find it, because finding it by accident would have felt like a sign of distrust. And she had believed, then, that distrust was the thing most dangerous to a marriage. She had filed it in the floor, actually beneath a board in her home studio. A loose plank she'd discovered while refinishing the floor herself in the first year they'd moved in, which she'd turned into a small, fireproof cache for documents she wanted to keep private. The prenuptial agreement, the original Sterling corporate documents, her grandfather's pocket watch. She hadn't been back to that floor in 2 years. From the used SUV she drove to client sites and auction houses and storage facilities. She watched the bistro on the corner of Erie and rushed through the rain-blurred window. Julian and Bianca were at the corner table by the window. She could see them clearly from the car. The easy intimacy of two people who had stopped being careful about being seen. Bianca laughed at something, her hand on Julian's forearm, and Julian leaned in, and the casualness of it, the absolute, unself-conscious casualness, hit Nora somewhere beneath the sternum like a cold hand pressing flat. That bistro had been her grandmother's favorite restaurant. It had been in the Sterling family trust until 4 years ago, when her estate manager had sold it as part of a portfolio consolidation. She hadn't objected at the time. She hadn't thought she needed to. She drove home through the fog. She sat in the parking structure for 3 minutes with her hands in her lap, breathing. Then she took the manila folder out of her bag, walked around to the trunk, and put it in the lockbox she kept there for client documents. Locked it, pocketed the key. Then she went inside and made dinner and asked Julian about his day, and listened to him talk about the merger and the board and the things that mattered, and said nothing at all about what she'd found. She was very, very good at making a room look like nothing had changed. The Sterling Steel Gala had been held at the Art Institute of Chicago every December for 22 years. Robert Sterling had started it the year Nora turned 13, a fundraiser that was also, if you knew how to read the room, a statement of intent. The Art Institute's grand staircase could hold 400 people. And the kind of people who attended the gala were the kind who understood that a room was never just a room. It was a declaration. It was territory. Nora arrived at 7 o'clock in her work vehicle, because she was there in a professional capacity. The event coordinator had contracted her firm 6 weeks ago to handle the staging and decor, the table arrangements, the floral installations. The directional lighting she'd spec'd out with the venue's technical team over 3 separate site visits. The work was good. She knew it was good. The bronze and ivory arrangements along the East Gallery wall had taken her assistant Marcus 2 full days to assemble, and the lighting wash over the Thorn Miniature Room's corridor had the exact warm, amber quality that made people slow down and feel, without knowing why, that they were somewhere significant. She was wearing her work vest and carrying a clipboard when Julian found her near the service entrance at 7:15. "Stay in the background tonight," he said, without preamble and without looking at her directly. He was in black tie, his cufflinks catching the light, his hair precise. He smelled of the same floral perfume that had been on his tie. Which was not something she had expected to encounter at a professional event, and which told her, with the clarity of a door locking, that he had given up being careful. "I'm working," Nora said. "I know you're working. That's what I mean. Stay near the walls. Keep the furniture straight, check the arrangements, do whatever it is you need to do, but don't circulate. I have board members here tonight, and Henderson's contacts, and I need the room to feel a certain way." She looked at him steadily. "I'm the one who made the room feel that way." "Nora." His voice dropped. "Don't make this difficult. This is important." He walked away toward the grand staircase, and she watched him go with the clipboard held flat against her chest. Her breathing even, her expression arranged into the professional neutrality she had spent years perfecting. The gala filled in over the following hour 400 people in evening wear, the kind of Chicago money that wore its certainty like a second skin. Nora moved through the edges of the room the way she always moved through a finished staging checking. Adjusting, invisible in the way that people with clipboards in service roles are always invisible at events like this. She knew this room. She knew the sight lines and the acoustics and the particular way. The light from the north skylights fell across the East Gallery floor at 8 o'clock in December. She had made this room. She knew it better than anyone here. She was near the floral installation at the base of the grand staircase when Julian took the microphone. He was good at this. She had always known that about him, the ease with which he commanded attention, the particular calibration of his voice when he was performing authority. He thanked the board. He thanked the major donors. He spoke about Sterling's merger with Meridian Partners as though it were a vision he had conjured himself, a future he had personally willed into existence. And the 400 people in the grand staircase listened with the engaged, admiring attention of people in the presence of a man who seemed to know where he was going. "And I want to take a moment," Julian said, his voice warming into something that sounded almost tender, "to introduce someone who has been an extraordinary partner in everything we're building here. The true creative muse behind Sterling's vision for the future." He extended a hand toward the East Gallery entrance. Bianca Rossi. Bianca walked into the room the way she'd clearly rehearsed unhurried. The slow confidence of a woman who understood the effect she was producing, wearing a deep red gown that caught every light in the room. She was 27 and she was beautiful, and she took Julian's hand at the base of the stairs. While 400 people applauded, and not one of them looked at the woman in the beige vest standing 5 feet away holding a clipboard. Nora looked at Julian's face as he watched Bianca cross the room toward him. He was proud. Not performing pride actually, genuinely proud, the way a man looks when he believes he has acquired something valuable. She had seen that expression on his face before. She had believed, when she first saw it, that it was directed at her. The applause was still fading when Bianca turned and noticed her. It was a deliberate noticing, the kind that takes a half-second too long to be accidental. Bianca's eyes moved from the clipboard to the work vest to Nora's face, and then her expression arranged itself into something that was almost a smile. She reached for a glass of red wine from a passing tray, and in the moment when she turned back toward the staircase, her elbow caught the rim of the glass. The wine landed across Nora's chest in a clean diagonal sweep. Dark red against beige linen. The sound Bianca made was a light, musical laugh. "Oh, I'm so sorry. Cheap linen in a room full of silk. I should have been more careful." The people nearest them turned to look. Nora felt the quality of their attention shift. The particular, acute discomfort of witnesses to a social injury who are deciding whether to acknowledge it or look away. Most of them looked away. One woman near the pillar met Nora's eyes for a fraction of a second with an expression of naked pity before turning back to her companion. Julian was at her side in an instant. Not to help. She understood that in the first half-second, before he'd opened his mouth. He was at her side the way a person moves to manage a situation that is threatening to become embarrassing. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a $50 bill. He pressed it into her hand in front of the board members and the donors and the 400 people who had been watching Sterling's future get introduced from the grand staircase. "Go get cleaned up," he said, low and smooth. "There's a service sink near the freight elevator. You're going to ruin the aesthetic." She heard someone near the pillar clear their throat softly. She heard the orchestra in the East Gallery resume its waltz. She looked at the $50 bill in her palm, the small, casual indifference of it, the way it had been produced without hesitation, as though the transaction were ordinary. As though this were a thing a man did for the woman he'd married. She looked up. Julian had already turned back toward Bianca. The wine was cold on her chest, soaking through the linen. The orchestra played the waltz with bright, formal precision, the sound bouncing off the high ceilings and coming back down amplified and slightly mocking. The board members were looking at their phones, at the room, at each other, anywhere but at the tired woman in the stained vest. Standing at the base of the grand staircase with a $50 bill in her hand and a clipboard she was gripping hard enough to crack the plastic edge. She looked at the faces around her, the careful neutrality, the polite avoidance, the faint, uncomfortable pity of people watching someone small be made smaller, and thought. With extraordinary clarity, they think they're looking at a servant. They are standing in my house. She looked at Julian's back. She crumpled the bill in her fist, slowly and with great deliberateness, the paper going soft in her palm. "You have no idea," she said, very quietly, to the back of his head, "what you just spent." He didn't hear her. The waltz covered it. The 400 people in the grand staircase were already moving on, the way crowds always do, closing the gap, smoothing over the rough spot. Returning to the easy flow of money and conversation and the comfortable belief that a room full of important people is a room in which only important things happen. She walked to the service corridor with the wine stain drying on her chest and the $50 bill in her fist, and she did not go to the service sink. She walked past it, all the way to the end of the corridor, to the small supply room where she'd stored the overflow decorating materials that morning. And she sat on a stack of folded moving blankets that smelled of industrial cleaner and dust, the smell of physical work. Honest work, work that left marks on your hands and your clothes. And she pulled out her phone and sent Arthur Henderson a single text. The audit, everything, as fast as possible. His reply came back in under a minute. Already started. Be careful. The waltz was still audible, faintly, through the supply room door. She sat with the industrial smell around her and the wine drying cold against her skin and the crumpled $50 bill still in her hand. And she thought about the room she had built on the other side of that door, and the 40 hours of work it had taken. And the 22 years of galas, and the man her father had been, and what he had built it all for. She thought about a prenuptial agreement filed under a floorboard on the north side of Lincoln Park. She thought about a clause. The waltz ended. In the brief silence before the next piece began, she could hear the crystalline sound of 400 champagne glasses being raised. And the low roar of 400 voices agreeing with each other about the future. She sat quietly in the supply room and let them agree. She found the legal documents in Julian's briefcase on a Thursday morning in early December, 3 weeks after the gala. She hadn't been looking for them. She'd been looking for the car insurance renewal notice that had arrived in the mail and that she'd last seen on the kitchen counter, and Julian's briefcase was open on the bench by the door, and the folder was right there, the tab labeled in Julian's handwriting with the name of a law firm she didn't recognize, Cassidy and Wren, P.C., and a case number. She picked it up. She read the first page. Petition for appointment of guardian of the person in estate. Respondent Eleanor Catherine Vance, née Sterling, age 35. Petitioner Julian R. Vance, spouse. Grounds respondent exhibits persistent symptoms consistent with cognitive and emotional impairment, including documented episodes of paranoia, memory disturbance, and irrational financial decision-making, rendering her unable to manage her personal affairs or assets. The kitchen was very bright. December morning light came in flat and white through the east window, and the refrigerator made its small mechanical hum, and somewhere outside a car alarm went off and was silenced. And Nora stood by the front door and read the petition for her own legal guardianship all the way to the end. He was going to take her assets. Not through divorce, through incapacitation. Through a court declaring that she was not competent to manage herself. He had found a way that, if it worked, would give him not just half of what she had under marital property law, but everything she had, managed under his authority, indefinitely. The paranoia he'd named in the petition was the paranoia he'd spent 3 months carefully constructing, the gaslighting over the kitchen table. The gentle mentions to mutual friends that she seemed off lately, the reference to Dr. Kowalski that he'd dropped in the argument over the insurance claim. He had been building this. Methodically, quietly, with the same patience she'd once admired in him. She put the folder back in the briefcase exactly as she'd found it. She zipped the case closed. She stood in the kitchen for 4 minutes without moving. Then she picked up her phone to call Arthur. The call went straight to voicemail, and she remembered he was in court this morning, a deposition that ran until noon. She left no message. She could not, in that moment, trust the steadiness of her voice enough to leave a message. She sat down on the kitchen floor. She did this deliberately, because her legs felt unreliable and the floor was solid and she needed something solid. The tile was cold through her jeans. She pressed her back against the kitchen island and pulled her knees to her chest and looked at the opposite wall. Her phone showed her banking app. She opened it automatically, the muscle memory of financial vigilance she'd developed over the past 3 weeks. The joint checking account had a normal balance. The joint savings account looked normal. She navigated to her personal savings account, the one she'd maintained in her own name, pre-marriage, the account she deposited her staging income into. The balance was $247. She stared at the number. She navigated away and came back, because sometimes a screen refreshes wrong, and the number changed to $247.14. She checked the transaction history. 2 days ago, a legal hold had been placed on the account, a temporary freeze pending the guardianship petition, approved by a judge she'd never heard of on the basis of an affidavit she hadn't seen. The account was functionally inaccessible. He had moved faster than she'd realized. He or his attorney had filed a motion she hadn't been notified of, through a process that had apparently begun before the gala, before the argument over the insurance claim. Before any of the conversations she'd thought were confrontations but had actually been intelligence gathering on his part. She navigated to her retirement fund. Locked. The same freeze, 2 different accounts. A third account, a brokerage account she'd opened after her father died, was showing a legal notice where the balance should be. She was sitting on the kitchen floor of a house she co-owned, in a city built on a fortune her grandfather had accumulated across 40 years. And she had $247 available to her name. She got up off the floor. She went to the supply closet and got her overnight bag from the top shelf, the one she kept packed for early morning client travel. And she took it to the bedroom and put in 3 changes of clothes, her laptop, her external hard drive, her grandfather's pocket watch, and the original copies of her Northwestern degree and her business license that she kept in the top drawer of the nightstand. Then she went to the home studio and she lifted the loose board in the northwest corner of the floor. And she took out the waterproof document envelope that had been there for 4 years. She unzipped it and made sure everything was inside the prenuptial agreement. The original Sterling corporate documentation, and the notarized letter from her father's estate attorney that she had carried as a talisman and never expected to need. Everything was there. She re-zipped the envelope and put it in the overnight bag. Then she went back to the supply closet, where she kept her staging supplies, and she took the overnight bag to her work vehicle in the parking structure. And she locked it in the trunk with the lockbox key she kept on a separate ring from her house keys. She came back upstairs. She made herself a cup of coffee. She sat at the kitchen table and drank it. From her bag she pulled a crumpled piece of paper, a social security notice that had arrived 2 weeks ago and that she'd been meaning to deal with. She unfolded it and looked at it again properly for the first time. A notice of non-payment. Julian had stopped filing joint taxes a year ago. The unpaid liability was accruing penalties. Her Social Security contributions for the past tax year were showing a gap that created a gap in her legal benefit record. One more thread pulled loose from the fabric of her existence on paper. The distant sound of a siren drifted up from Lakeshore Drive, rising and fading in the cold air. She thought about what it would feel like to scream, not the performance of it, but the actual physical release of it, the thing your chest does when you have been holding something too long and too tight and your body simply runs out of capacity to contain it. She thought about how her father used to say that the difference between a breakdown and a breakthrough was usually just timing. In the storage unit in the Gold Coast building where she kept her staging inventory, the overflow furniture, the decorative objects, the folded moving blankets and crated artwork and bolts of fabric, there was a small, clear space near the back wall. She drove there that afternoon. She sat in the folding chair she kept for client walkthroughs with the overnight bag between her feet and the document envelope in her lap. And the smell of dust and cedar and industrial cleaner surrounded her. And she looked at the concrete wall and allowed herself, finally, to feel the full weight of what was happening to her. She had stripped her last name away and filed it in a floorboard. And moved furniture for 6 years for a man who had spent that time mapping the geometry of her destruction. She had believed she was building a life. She had been providing the materials for her own erasure. She picked up a crystal vase from the nearest shelf, a staging prop, Waterford, heavy and irreplaceable, and she threw it at the concrete wall. The sound of it was enormous in the enclosed space. The silence after it was even larger. She sat in that silence for a long time. Her hands were shaking. Her breathing was ragged and then, gradually, not ragged. The pieces of the vase caught the storage unit's single fluorescent light in small, scattered fragments, and she looked at them for a while, and then she looked at the concrete wall, and then she looked at the document envelope in her lap. "I am Eleanor Sterling," she said, to the concrete and the dust and the broken glass and no one else. Her voice was steady. She hadn't known it would be steady. It surprised her. She picked up her phone and called Arthur. This time he answered. Nora. His voice was careful and even. He had seen the guardianship petition. She understood from his tone that he already knew. His forensic accountant contact had flagged something earlier that morning. "Where are you?" "The Gold Coast storage unit." "Stay there. Don't go home tonight. I'll have someone meet you with a hotel key within the hour." A pause. "And Nora, I need you to listen to me very carefully." "I'm listening." Being a ghost, Arthur said, slowly and with great deliberateness, has certain advantages. We're going to use them. She looked at the broken glass on the concrete floor. She thought about how a shattered object, in the right light, could look like something intentional. Like a design choice. Like the beginning of something new rather than the end of something else. Tell me everything, she said. Friends, if you've been with us through these first 4 parts of Nora's story, thank you for staying. Take a breath, because I know this one has been a lot to carry. We've watched a woman who built beauty for a living get systematically dismantled by the man who was supposed to love her. The stolen money, the forged signatures, the $50 bill handed to her in front of Chicago's most powerful people. And now a legal attempt to declare her insane and take everything she has left. At 35 years old, Eleanor Sterling is sitting on a storage room floor with $247 to her name, surrounded by broken glass. But here's what I want you to hold on to as we head into the second half. Nora still has the prenuptial agreement. She still has Arthur. And she still knows something Julian Vance has never once considered, that the woman he's been calling the help has been running the house the whole time. The reversal is coming, and I think you're going to find it deeply, deeply satisfying. Stay with us. She had been 29 years old and standing in a hardware store in Wicker Park when she decided to stop being Eleanor Sterling for a while. Not permanently, not with any intention of deception. Just a rest from it. From the particular weight of a name that had appeared in the Tribune business section reliably for 4 decades, that made people in certain rooms look at you a specific way before you'd said a word. She was tired of being looked at that way. She wanted, with the simple, unglamorous urgency of a person who had been performing a role since childhood, to be looked at normally. She had been Nora since college. Her roommate freshman year had started it, some abbreviation. Born from the chaos of a shared dorm room and too much coffee and the particular intimacy of people becoming themselves for the first time away from their families. Nora. It fit differently than Eleanor. Lighter, less formal, more like the person she actually was when no one was keeping a particular eye on her. She had kept her staging business under her married name after the wedding, because that was the practical thing: the business license, the insurance, the client contracts, all of it was already filed as Nora Vance by then, and changing it would have been a disruption she hadn't wanted. She had never hidden the name from Julian directly. She had simply never brought it up, and he had never asked. And the months had become a year, and the year had become 2 years, and the subject had calcified quietly into a thing that neither of them touched. In the storage unit in the Gold Coast building, on a folding chair with Arthur's voice still in her ear from the call that had ended 20 minutes ago, she let herself sit with the memory of the man Julian had been in the beginning, or the man she had believed he was. Which was not quite the same thing, and which she was only now fully accepting as a distinction that mattered. He had proposed on a Tuesday. Not a special occasion, not a planned moment, a Tuesday in March when the Chicago weather couldn't decide between winter and spring. And the light on the lake was doing something complicated and beautiful. A simple silver band from his coat pocket. As long as we have each other, he'd said, we are the richest people in Chicago. She had believed him completely, with the totality of belief available only to someone who has decided to trust and committed to it without reservation. She had called the board 2 weeks later discreetly, through Arthur, not in her own name, and recommended Julian Vance for the EVP position. She had believed she was building something. She had thought the word nest and meant it without irony. She had thought she was weaving the threads of 2 separate lives into one strong thing. She had taken him to see the Gold Coast penthouse that first winter. Not to stage it, it hadn't been listed yet, but because she knew the listing agent and had called in a favor. And she had wanted to see how he looked standing in a place like that, if it would make him feel something particular. He had stood at the window with the lake below them and said, one day I'll own a place like this. And you'll never have to work a day again. She had smiled and thought he meant it as a gift. She had not understood, then, that what he was expressing was not generosity but appetite. The business retreat in Aspen, the one she had paid for through the Sterling corporate events budget. The one she'd approved personally because Julian had asked and she had trusted him, that was where he had met Bianca Rossi. She knew this now from the forensic accounting, from the credit card records Arthur's contact had pulled, from the receipt for dinner for 2 at a restaurant in Aspen that Julian had expensed as a client meeting. The betrayal had a start date. It had coordinates. It was a place and a moment she had funded with her own money and her own faith, and he had used it to begin the process of replacing her. Every I love you had been a transaction she hadn't known she was conducting. She sat with that for a moment. Let it be fully, completely true. Didn't try to soften it or find the generous interpretation or give him the benefit of the doubt that she had been giving him, reflexively, for 4 years. Then she reached into the overnight bag and pulled out the document envelope. She unzipped it. She removed the prenuptial agreement, 15 pages, signed by both of them, notarized by a judge who had since been appointed to the state appellate court. She turned to page 9. Section 14b, Moral Turpitude and Asset Protection Clause. In the event that either party is found to have engaged in conduct constituting financial fraud, forgery, asset concealment, or willful deception causing material harm to the other party, all joint and contested assets shall revert to the aggrieved party in their entirety. Discovery of an extramarital relationship concurrent with such conduct shall constitute additional grounds for full asset forfeiture under this clause. She had insisted on this clause. Arthur had drafted it and she had read it twice and signed it and filed it in the floorboard and not thought about it again. Because she had been 29 and in love and had not genuinely expected to need it. She had thought of it the way people think of smoke detectors: you install them not because you plan to have a fire, but because you understand that the world contains fire. Her hands were steady when she refolded the document. The past wasn't a memory. She understood that now with the clarity of someone who has been using the wrong map and has finally found the right one. The past was a blueprint. Everything Julian had done, every move he'd made, every signature he'd forged, he had signed his own destruction into the record, quietly and completely. And she had been standing next to the record the whole time. She put the agreement back in the envelope. She put the envelope in the bag. She zipped it closed. Then she called Arthur back and told him about Section 14b. His silence lasted 3 full seconds. I drafted that clause, he said, quietly. I know. Another silence. Then, with a precision that reminded her of her father, we're going to need the gala. The diner on West Diversey had been there since 1971. It had the particular permanence of Chicago places that have survived everything the city can throw at them. The deep booth seating worn smooth by decades of elbows and winter coats. The coffee that arrived in a heavy ceramic mug without you asking, the specific quality of morning light through windows that had been cleaned recently but not too recently. It was the kind of place where no one looked up when you came in, which was exactly why Arthur Henderson had suggested it. He was already in the back booth when Nora arrived, a Thursday morning in mid-December, 10 days after the gala. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him and his reading glasses on and a cup of coffee that appeared untouched. He looked like a man doing paperwork, which he was. But he also looked like a man who had been thinking hard for several days and had arrived at conclusions he was prepared to act on. She slid into the booth across from him. The waitress appeared and Nora ordered coffee and a piece of toast without looking at the menu. Talk to me, she said. Arthur turned the legal pad to face her. On it he had written, in his small precise handwriting, a numbered list. She counted 15 items. The forensic accountant finished the preliminary report at 6 o'clock this morning, he said. Julian has moved a total of $840,000 from accounts associated with you or Sterling Corporate over the past 3 years. Not including the 401k withdrawal, which brings the total to just over $1.1 million. He took off his glasses. He's been systematic about it. Small amounts, irregular intervals, multiple destination accounts, the kind of pattern designed to stay below the automatic reporting thresholds. Nora wrapped her hands around the coffee mug the waitress had placed in front of her. The ceramic was warm and solid. And the forgeries? 5 documents, confirmed. 2 401k authorization forms, the mortgage modification that spiked the interest rate, the health insurance beneficiary form that allowed him to add Bianca Rossi as a covered dependent under your name, and a letter of consent for the offshore account that was filed with your brokerage. He paused. He used a skilled forger. Not a printer, a person, someone with experience. The signatures are very close to yours. They wouldn't have fooled a forensic document examiner, but they were good enough to fool administrative clerks. Do we know who the forger is? We have a lead. It doesn't matter for the moment, the documents themselves are the evidence. He tapped the legal pad. What matters is this: we have enough. We have more than enough. The question is how we use it. Nora set down her coffee mug. Tell me about the gala. Arthur's expression shifted a barely perceptible movement. The particular adjustment of a man who has been thinking about something from multiple angles and has arrived at the angle that works. Sterling's annual gala is in 11 days. Julian is speaking as EVP. The board will be there. The major shareholders will be there. The press will be there. He paused. And you are contracted to stage the event. I am. Which means you have access to the venue from setup through teardown. Including the technical booth. He let that land. The venue runs a custom AV system. I had our technology consultant look at it. The main display screens are networked through a single control interface in the production booth. They're used to show the speaker's presentation slides. Nora looked at him across the table. You want to put the audit on the screens. I want to give you the option of putting the audit on the screens, Arthur said carefully. The decision is yours. But yes. In a room containing the full Sterling board, 300 witnesses, and working journalists from the Tribune and Crane's Chicago business. That is where the prenuptial clause has maximum force. That is where the termination of his contract, the fraud charges, and the guardianship petition collapse simultaneously and publicly. There are risks, Nora said. There are always risks. The risk here is primarily reputational for you, not just him. People will know you were hiding your identity. Some of them will think less of you for it. He looked at her steadily. Some of them will understand it perfectly. She looked out the diner window at the December street. A delivery truck was idling at the corner, its exhaust hanging white in the cold air. A woman in a down coat walked past with a small dog on a short leash, the dog stepping carefully over the patches of old ice on the sidewalk. Chicago in December: ordinary, particular, real. The city her grandfather had built a company in. The city her father had left to her. What do I need to do? She said. Arthur turned back to the legal pad. 3 things. First, the digital ledger. Everything the forensic accountant has compiled needs to be formatted for visual display. Amounts, dates, account numbers, destination accounts. The forgeries need high-resolution scans. This is your evidence, and it needs to be readable on a 20-foot screen by people who don't have financial backgrounds. I can do that. Second, the prenuptial agreement, specifically Section 14B. I'll prepare a single-page summary in plain language: what it says, what it means, what it triggers. I'll stand in that room and present it directly to the board. And third? He looked at her. You need to walk into that room as Eleanor Sterling. The diner was warm and smelled of coffee and butter, and from somewhere in the kitchen came the sound of pans. The ordinary percussion of a place that had been feeding people through all weathers for 50 years. Nora sat in the worn booth and thought about the backless silk gown that had been hanging in the back of her studio closet since her last formal appearance. As a Sterling, a gallery opening 2 years before the wedding, a different lifetime. She thought about the Sterling signet ring in the bottom of her travel jewelry case. Heavy yellow gold with the S inset in carnelian, the ring her father had commissioned for her 30th birthday and that she had worn exactly twice. She thought about what it meant to stage a room. To arrange its elements so precisely, so deliberately, that the people inside it felt a particular thing without knowing why. You had to know the room. You had to understand its geometry and its light and its history. You had to be willing to move things. She was very, very good at moving things. All right, she said. Over the next 10 days, she worked. She worked the way she worked a difficult staging job, methodically. Without wasted motion, with the specific and focused energy of someone who has decided exactly what they want a room to look like and is building toward that endpoint. Arthur's forensic accountant packaged the financial data into a presentation file. Nora spent 3 evenings at her laptop reformatting it, pulling the most damning figures. The ones that told the story without commentary, the offshore transfers with their neat timestamps, the forged signature documents side by side with her authenticated handwriting samples. She made it clean and legible and precise, because the most effective evidence was evidence that didn't need to be explained. She visited the venue on a regular staging pretense 3 times in 10 days. Checking arrangements, supervising her assistants, establishing her presence as entirely routine. The production booth was unlocked during setup hours. The AV technician was named Greg, and he was 24 years old and extremely helpful when she asked, with professional casualness, whether she could run a test slide through the display system to check the color rendering on her floral arrangement photos. She found a silk gown in her size at a consignment shop on Oak Street, not the one from the closet, which she had decided to save. This one was midnight blue, with a draped back and a weight that moved correctly when she walked. It cost $600, and she paid cash from the emergency fund she'd been building in a new account under her maiden name since the week after the gala. The signet ring she cleaned herself, with a soft cloth and a little warm water, until the gold was bright and the carnelian caught the light. On the night before the gala, she sat in her hotel room. She had not gone back to the Lincoln Park house since the morning. She'd found the guardianship petition and she laid out everything she needed on the bed. The gown, the ring, the flash drive with the audit presentation, Arthur's one-page summary of Section 14B, her phone, her staging credentials for venue access, and the original prenuptial agreement in its document envelope, because she wanted it physically present in the room, in her hands, when everything shifted. She looked at these things for a long time. Then she opened her laptop and reviewed the venue floor plan one final time, marking the location of the production booth, the stage, the main entrance, and the position of the board members' reserved seating. She checked the screen display timing. She set her alarm for 5:30. She had staged thousands of rooms. She had arranged furniture and light and spatial relationships until a room told the story she wanted it to tell, until the people inside it felt exactly what she intended them to feel. Tomorrow night she was going to stage the most important room she had ever worked in. And she already knew exactly where everything went. The Art Institute of Chicago looked the way it always looked in December, the stone lions on the front steps wearing their seasonal wreaths. The building lit from below against the dark sky, the grand staircase visible through the glass entrance as a warm column of amber light. 400 people moved through the entrance in evening wear and December coats, the particular sound of a major gala beginning, heels on marble. The murmur of greeting, the first notes of the string quartet warming up somewhere inside. Nora arrived at 5:30 in the afternoon in her work vehicle, in her staging clothes, carrying a clipboard. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it had been every time she'd walked into this building in the past month. She was Nora Vance, home stager, service entrance, clipboard, invisible. By 6:15, the staging was done. Her assistants had been released for the evening. The floral installations were exactly where they needed to be. The lighting was exactly what she'd specified. The room was, objectively, beautiful. She knew it the way a craftsperson knows a finished piece of work. With the quiet, factual satisfaction of a job executed well. At 6:30, she went to the freight elevator and took it to the basement level. In the equipment storage room she'd reserved for staging overflow, she changed into the midnight blue gown. She pinned her hair up with the 2 gold clips she'd carried in her blazer pocket. She put on the signet ring, and the familiar weight of it, the solid, specific gravity of her father's gift, the S in carnelian, pressing into her palm, settled something in her chest that had been unsettled for a long time. She looked at herself in the small mirror propped against the storage shelving, and saw, for the first time in longer than she could precisely account for, the woman her father had raised. She took the flash drive from her blazer pocket and transferred it to a small clutch she'd left in the staging bag. She folded Arthur's one-page summary of Section 14B and placed it in the clutch beside the drive. She folded her staging clothes neatly and left them on the shelf. She put the clipboard on top of them. At 7 o'clock, she walked into the production booth. Greg, the AV technician, was at the control board running a pre-show systems check. He looked up when she came in and his expression moved through several stages. Recognition of a familiar face, mild confusion about the dress, recalibration before settling on the professional neutrality of a young man deciding not to ask questions above his pay grade. "Quick favor," she said, producing the flash drive. "I need the second half of the presentation file replaced with this. The speaker will signal when to advance." Greg took the drive, looked at it. "Mr. Vance submitted his presentation yesterday," he said carefully. "I know," Nora said. "The board has requested a supplemental presentation. You'll see the new file is labeled clearly. Everything before slide 12 stays the same." She held his gaze. Arthur Henderson authorized this. Greg plugged in the drive. She walked out of the production booth and took a position near the East Gallery entrance, where the sightline to the stage was clean. And the distance to the main entrance was manageable. She could feel the room from here, the 400 people settling into their tables, the board members in their reserved seating along the west wall. The journalists from the Tribune and Cranes with their notebooks and their quiet, watchful attention. Arthur was somewhere in the room. She'd texted him 30 minutes ago ready. His reply had been 2 words in position. Julian took the stage at 8 o'clock precisely. He looked, as he always looked at moments like this, completely at ease, a man in his natural habitat, comfortable in the light. He thanked the board. He thanked the donors. He launched into the Meridian merger presentation with the smooth, assured delivery of a man who had rehearsed it until it had become indistinguishable from conviction. Slide 12 was the moment she'd marked. The transition point between the merger data and the vision for Sterling's future section that Julian had been particularly proud of. She watched the screen from the East Gallery entrance. She watched the slide counter in the lower corner. Slide 11. The room was attentive and warm. Slide 12 loaded. The first number on the screen was $843,000. Beneath it, transfers from Sterling corporate accounts to undisclosed offshore holdings, 2022-2025. Below that, a clean table, dates, amounts, destination account numbers. The formatting was elegant. She had spent time on the formatting. The shift in the room happened in layers. The board members in the west section registered it first. She saw the movement as heads turned toward the screen. The particular double take of people who are seeing something they didn't expect and are trying to understand what they're actually seeing. Then the journalists. Then the room in general, the wave of attention turning from Julian to the screen behind him with the slow, inexorable quality of a tide changing direction. Julian turned around. She would remember the specific quality of that moment, not his expression, because she was too far away to read it in detail. But the physical fact of it, the turning of his body, the moment of seeing the screen and knowing. There was a beat of absolute stillness, and then the ballroom erupted into the particular noise of 400 people. Discovering simultaneously that something has gone very wrong for someone they thought they knew. She walked toward the stage. The crowd parted not deliberately, but with the reflexive movement of people registering something significant approaching. She was aware of being seen, of the way the midnight blue gown and the signet ring and the simple fact of her walking directly toward the stage without hesitation were communicating something that 400 people were processing in real time. She heard her name, not Nora, not Mrs. Vance, but Eleanor. Someone in the crowd said it, and then someone else. Arthur stepped forward from his position near the west wall. He was carrying a document, the prenuptial agreement, the original, in a clear protective sleeve. He moved to the base of the stage steps and waited. She climbed the stage. Julian was standing at the podium with the expression of a man whose scaffolding has been removed without warning. And who is discovering, in real time, that he has no idea how to stand without it. He was looking at her, at the gown, at the ring, at whatever he could see in her face. And his expression cycled through several things she recognized and several she didn't. Disbelief. Calculation. Something that might have been the first real fear she'd ever seen in him. Julian, she said. Her voice carried. The microphone was still live. She didn't need it, but it was useful. You missed a spot in the seating chart. Mine. She turned to the room. 400 people, the board, the press, the investors. The Chicago elite who had watched her stand in a stained work vest 2 weeks ago and decided she was invisible. She stood at the center of the stage under the lights her father had paid for in a room her father had built. And she said, clearly and without raising her voice, "My name is Eleanor Sterling. I am the majority shareholder of Sterling Heavy Industries, and I am the owner of this building, this company, and the very air you are currently breathing. Arthur Henderson, my attorney and the Sterling family's legal counsel, has something the board needs to see." Arthur mounted the steps and placed the prenuptial agreement on the podium. He addressed the board directly, with the precise, unhurried clarity of a man who had been preparing this statement for 11 days. Section 14b. Financial fraud, forgery, asset concealment, concurrent extramarital relationship, full asset forfeiture under the clause. The language was technical and the implications were not. The room was very quiet. One of the senior board members, Gerald Okafor, who had been on the Sterling board for 16 years and had known her father personally, stood up from the west section and said, in the carrying tone of a man who has made many such pronouncements, Julian Vance, effective immediately, you are terminated from your position as Executive Vice President of Sterling Industries, pending a full legal and forensic review of your conduct. Two of the security personnel, older men who had worked this building since the 90s, men her father had employed and trusted, appeared at either side of the stage. They did not touch Julian. They simply stood. It was enough. Julian looked at Nora. She had thought, in the preceding days, about what this moment would feel like. She had expected something cathartic, some large, clarifying emotion, relief or triumph, or the specific satisfaction of justice. What she felt, standing on the stage under the lights, was something quieter and more grounded than any of those things. She felt like herself. Simply, entirely herself, for the first time in 4 years. She reached into the clutch. She produced the $50 bill. She had kept it, ironed flat, in the document envelope for 2 weeks. She held it out to Julian. Keep it, she said. You're going to need it for the bus. He looked at the bill in her extended hand for a moment. Then the security personnel moved, and he moved with them, and the grand staircase swallowed them up, and he was gone. The flashbulbs started immediately after the journalists had their phones out, and the press photographers who covered the gala had turned from the stage to the crowd and back to the stage, and the white light came in bursts and waves. And Nora stood at the center of it and let them take their pictures, because the record mattered and she was no longer interested in being invisible. She looked at Gerald Okafor. He was watching her with an expression she recognized her father had worn it occasionally, a particular combination of assessment and respect. He nodded once. She nodded back. For once, she said, quietly, to no one in particular, the paperwork protected me instead of erasing me. The terrace of Sterling Tower was 41 floors above Lake Shore Drive, and in December it was not a place for lingering. The wind off the lake was direct and unsparing, the kind of cold that cleared your head whether you wanted it cleared or not. Nora stood at the railing on the morning of the 23rd, 6 days after the gala, in her heaviest coat, with her hands wrapped around a travel mug of coffee, and looked at the city. She had stood on this terrace before, many times as a child with her father. When the building was still being finished, as a young woman during the estate transition after he died, once in the year before her marriage when she'd come here specifically to remember who she was. But she had never stood here and felt, as she felt now, that the skyline was simply home. Not a symbol, not a weight, not a thing to be proved or protected or escaped. Just hers, the glass and steel running south along the lakefront. The pale winter sky above it, the gray water shifting below, the city going about its particular, relentless business of existing. The legal process had moved with a speed she hadn't anticipated and Arthur had quietly predicted. The guardianship petition had been withdrawn within 48 hours of the gala, after Julian's attorney received the full forensic accounting report, along with a letter from Arthur Henderson that had, from what Arthur described, had a clarifying effect on their strategic outlook. The account freezes were reversed. The stolen retirement funds were the subject of a civil recovery action that Arthur's team expected to conclude favorably within 6 months. The forgery case had been referred to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, which had, according to Arthur, received it with what he described as considerable enthusiasm. Julian had not contested any of it. She had not expected him to. A man who had built his position entirely on her foundation had very little to stand on once the foundation was withdrawn. He was living somewhere on the northwest side, in a studio apartment in a building that, if the shell company registration she'd requested hadn't been flagged for review, was technically owned by a subsidiary of her family trust. She had not arranged that deliberately. Arthur had pointed it out with the dry neutrality of a man who understood irony but preferred not to editorialize. Bianca Rossi had resigned from Sterling's marketing department the morning after the gala, before anyone had asked her to. She had sent an email that Arthur described as preemptively comprehensive in its self-exculpation. Nora had not read it. There was nothing in it she needed. The Sterling board had met twice since the gala. Gerald Okafor had chaired both meetings, and Nora had attended in person, sitting at the head of the table that had her grandfather's initials inlaid in the veneer at the far end. Drinking coffee from the same heavy ceramic mugs the board had used for 30 years. She had said what needed to be said and listened carefully to what needed to be heard and found, to her own mild surprise, that the room felt familiar. She had been absorbing the texture of that room her entire childhood. She simply hadn't known she was doing it. The Meridian merger had been paused pending the internal review. It would resume, Arthur thought, with revised terms that were considerably more favorable to Sterling's interests. Terms that Julian, in his eagerness to close the deal and collect the performance bonus he'd built into his own contract, had never negotiated adequately. She had spent 2 days reviewing the merger documents and had found, in that review, a genuine pleasure in the work. The architecture of a good deal was not unlike the architecture of a well-staged room. You needed to understand what the space was actually for, and what it needed to make the person inside it feel something true. The foundation had been her idea, and it had come to her at 3 in the morning 2 days after the gala, in the hotel room where she'd been staying, while she was lying awake thinking about women she'd known. Women in her staging network who'd mentioned, in the elliptical way people mention things they can't quite say directly, that their finances were complicated right now. Women at client sites who'd been apologetic about payment timelines in ways that suggested the money wasn't entirely in their control. Women who had signed things they didn't fully understand and hadn't been told, in any clear way, that they should have a lawyer look at them first. The Nora project would provide legal and financial consultation to individuals facing financial abuse within marriage, forensic accounting referrals, attorney access, document recovery support, protective filing assistance. It would be staffed by professionals and funded through the Sterling Family Trust at a level that meant it would not, under any circumstances, have to operate the way most underfunded advocacy organizations operated. Perpetually, anxiously, on the edge of being able to do the work. Arthur had been unreservedly enthusiastic about it. Gerald Okafor had offered the use of a Sterling conference room for the inaugural intake meetings. Her Northwestern architecture professor, who had sent a handwritten note after the gala coverage ran in the Tribune, had offered to connect her with a network of pro bono attorneys who'd been looking for an organized referral system. The name had taken her a night to settle on. She had considered several: the Sterling Foundation, the Eleanor Sterling Initiative, several more formal options that had the right gravity but the wrong warmth. Nora had come to her at 4 in the morning with the specific certainty of a thing that was simply true. Because Nora was the name she'd been when she was choosing freely. Nora was the person she'd been trying to be when she'd hidden Eleanor away, the woman who liked the smell of cedarwood and wanted to be loved for herself. And that woman deserved to have her name on something that protected people like her. On the morning of the 23rd, before she went to the terrace, she sat at her desk in the Sterling Tower office, her father's desk, which she'd had moved from storage the previous week, the solid walnut surface carrying the particular smell of old wood and decades of work, and she signed the merger document. Her own name. The pen moved steadily. She placed a single white lily in the small glass vase on the corner of the desk, because her father had kept a flower on his desk every day he'd worked here. And she had decided to continue that particular tradition, and white lilies meant what they had always meant to her: clarity. Beginning, the particular rightness of a thing in its proper place. She uncapped the sterling red lipstick, her grandmother's color, the particular deep red she'd worn to every board meeting and every gallery opening and every occasion that mattered, and that she'd given to Nora on her 21st birthday, with the instruction to wear it when she needed to remember she was a Sterling, and she put it on in the small mirror she'd propped against the desk lamp. Then she went to the terrace, and stood in the December wind, and looked at the city. Lake Michigan was doing what it did in winter, moving heavily and darkly under a pale sky. The water deep with cold, the surface catching the early light in long flat streaks of silver and gold. The city ran south and west and north from where she stood, dense and particular and real. A place built by people who had understood that building things required more than vision. It required endurance. It required the willingness to be wrong and start again and be wrong again. And keep going, because the thing you were building mattered more than the comfort of being done. She drank her coffee. The wind came off the lake in cold, steady waves. At 35, she had learned the hard way. The only way that certain lessons come that you could stage a room beautifully and still be living in it wrong. You could arrange all the surfaces, calibrate all the light, choose every object with care, and still have built a space around an absence. The most important space was not the one with the $15 million view. It was not the one with the velvet armchair and the floor-to-ceiling windows and the careful sightlines she'd perfected over 6 years of craft. It was the one inside her. The interior that no one else could arrange. The one she had been ignoring, in the particular way that people who are very good at caring for external spaces sometimes neglect the internal ones. Filling other people's rooms with beauty while their own walls went bare. She turned from the railing. Behind her, the tower rose up, glass and steel, the Sterling name on the facing 30 feet tall, catching the winter light. Her name, her father's name, her grandfather's name, 3 generations of people who had built things and left them for the generation that came next. She went back inside. There was a board meeting at 10. There were foundation intake interviews to review at 2. There was a staging consultation she'd agreed to do pro bono for a nonprofit housing project on the south side, because the work was good work. And she intended to keep doing it, and because the most effective thing about a well-staged room was that it reminded people quietly, without announcing itself, that they deserved to be somewhere that held them right. She sat at her father's desk. She looked at the white lily in its glass. She looked at her reflection in the dark screen of her laptop before she opened it, the sterling red lipstick. The signet ring, her own face, looking back at her with the particular steadiness of a person who knows, finally and without reservation, where they are. "Welcome home, Eleanor," she said. The sun came up over Lake Michigan and laid its gold across the city, and the day began. Friends, how did you find today's story? I've been sitting with Eleanor Sterling's journey since we began, and I have to tell you, there is something about this one that stays with you. A woman who hid her own name because she wanted to be loved for herself. Who moved furniture in rooms she actually owned. Who stood in a stained work vest and held a crumpled $50 bill and said, quietly, to a man who couldn't hear her, "You have no idea what you just spent." And then went and proved it. What Julian Vance never understood, what people like him never understand, is that a person who has built things knows how to build things. He saw a woman with a clipboard and missed the architect standing behind her. He saw the staging and missed the mind that designed it. He spent 4 years dismantling someone who was, the entire time, quietly learning where all the load-bearing walls were. There's a lesson in that, and I think most of us who've lived long enough have felt a version of it the moment when someone you trusted looked right at you and decided you were less than you were. Maybe it was in a marriage. Maybe it was at work. Maybe it was in a family that had its own idea of your worth and wasn't interested in revising it. And the question that moment asks the question Eleanor had to answer in that storage room on the floor. With broken glass around her and $247 in a frozen account is not how do I get back at them. It's who am I when no one is watching? What do I still have that they couldn't take? Eleanor had the prenuptial agreement. She had Arthur. She had 6 years of craft and a forensic accountant and a flash drive and a midnight blue gown. But most importantly, she had the willingness to stand in the light under her own name and say, "I was here the whole time." We all face moments where we have to decide who we are when everything is stripped away. Eleanor's moment was a storage room in the Gold Coast. Yours might look different, but the answer is the same. You are more than the name someone else put on you. You are more than the space they tried to keep you in. I hope Nora's story brought you a little comfort today. I hope it reminded you that a ghost can haunt, and a good architect always knows where the doors are. If this story moved you, and I hope it did, please subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And hit that like button for Eleanor, for Nora, for every woman who ever stood in her own room and had to fight to be seen in it. We'll see you next time, friends. Take good care of yourselves.